Investments, Debts and Transitions, Minister Hugh Hilton Todd from Guyana, President Mohamed Nasheed, Speaker of the Parliament from Maldives, Malshini Senaratne from the University of Seychelles, and of course Mr. Ausaf Sayeed, Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, India. We will have Preeti, Soni, Head of the UN Asia and Pacific Center for Transfer of Technology, moderate this session, we will begin immediately. So I request you all to settle down, and can I request the media not to crowd the top of the room? Can I request you all to please?
Yeah, I'm not whoever. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
These are all on or at the time?
Should we start? Yeah. Okay. Feels like this is on.
Thank you.
Very good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Can you hear me? Okay. You can hear. Welcome to today's evening session of the Raisina dialogue entitled Beachheads of Globalization, Investments, Debts and Transitions. I'm Preeti Soni. I head the United Nations Asian and Pacific Center for Transfer of Technology, APCTT. APCTT is a regional institution of UNESCAP. We work to support member countries, strengthen technology and innovation policies, and promote regional cooperation for technology transfer and betterment of the Asia-Pacific region and achievement of the SDGs. It is my honor and privilege to moderate the panel discussion over here today, comprising of very esteemed and eminent panelists. I must say the topic of today's conversation is extremely relevant. The focus is on maritime nations, including the small island states as well as emerging and fragile economies heavily dependent on marine and coastal ecosystems. Their role is extremely important in the global economy, particularly for global trade, for security, and meeting the SDGs as well as the Paris climate goals. Maritime nations also have their development challenges, including environmental stresses due to natural and human interventions, climate impacts, pollution, and more recently, the socio-economic implications of the pandemic. Given these, the nations are extremely important and instrumental in shaping the new low-carbon, or if I may say, low-emission and resilient development strategies and economic transitions, while dealing with the increasing cost of adaptation, and some of them also with increasing debt burdens due to different issues, including the recent COVID pandemic. The role of global partnerships, financial flows, coalitions in this regard will be very important in shaping these transitions. For example, leveraging on opportunities for blue economy, decarbonization of maritime transport, and inclusion of new and better technologies. The session today will dwell upon some of the challenges and opportunities faced by maritime nations, especially the SIDS. And we like to concentrate more on the small and island states. In light of the challenges posed by climate change and COVID, we are talking about globalization, resilience, climate change, and increasing debt burden. And we will also discuss the role of global partnerships, collaboration, private sector investment, and international financial instruments, while maintaining individual sovereignty as well as interests of these nations. I'll take a pause here and go straight to the panelists. I'll request them to take about 5 to 6 minutes to provide their remarks and also respond to the question directed at them. I've been asked to be very strict about the time, so please indulge in case the need be. Following the first round, I will also see how the conversation is going and we can have follow-up questions before we open it to the audience to ask their questions. Let me first go to Mr. Mohamed Nasheed, Honorable Speaker of the Parliament and former President of Maldives. As one of the leading climate advocates of the world, what are the key priorities of maritime nations, especially the SIDS, for the climate change perspectives? How can they collectively come together to protect developing country concerns? How will green investments, such as from the international instruments, help in this regard, while keeping the economic aspirations of SIDS in mind? Also, if you can talk about how they can come together and really take forward the agenda of climate change while keeping their interests in mind and also their sovereignty in mind.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And first, it's lovely to be here in Delhi and joining the Raisina dialogue. The blue economy and the oceans, they have the first impact. They are facing the first impacts of climate change. Firstly, the acidification and therefore of the ocean, increased temperature and therefore the impact that it has on the biodiversity. In the Maldives, for instance, our coral reefs are dying, they are bleaching. Our islands are there, the foundation of the islands are coral. And when the coral dies, we die. And when the coral dies, it also acts as a barrier against erosion. So the islands start eroding. When the coral die, we lose our biodiversity, therefore fishing goes down. And so we lose livelihood. When the coral dies, actually we die with it. This is a huge challenge on us. We've done nothing to create this situation at all. Now, how do we then overcome, or is it possible for us to adapt to this level where we can survive while the rest of the world goes business as usual? I don't think so. If we think that it is 30 years down the line that we are going to become carbon neutral, we don't have a conversation. There's no point talking about it. We will not exist. We will not be around. So climate change is very real, and it is happening now, and we must attend to it immediately. Now, in terms of how do we use the existing resources that we have, especially the blue resources that we have? Now, fishing. Maldives is a big fishing nation. We have 26,000 people going out fishing every morning. We catch fish one by one. We do not per se. We do not have nets. We do it pole and line, and we catch 250,000 tons of fish through pole and line. So there is no byproduct. We are not touching on any of the dolphins or turtles or any other such thing. And we get a very good return out of our fishing industry. Unfortunately, a number of islands have rented out their seas and brought in huge trawlers, and they are they are dragging the whole of the bed of the ocean. Now that is going to have a big impact. Now in the Indian Ocean Tuna Conference, for instance, on this feels that they should limit tuna catch. We also believe that, but I think we should regulate fishing methods. The world must come around and understand that it is not possible to go on fishing with nets. We must fish one by one. Now, I also would like to bring a point of debt. Most of our countries are very, very, very debt-ridden. And bulk of these debts and the assets created by the debts are not equal. The lender, and I must say this, China has lent us a lot of money, But they have intentionally increased the prices of these projects so that the business plan fails. And we can never pay back the money from these assets. If you evaluate the assets that we have and the debt we have, the assets are a third of the debt. And it will be impossible for any one of us to actually get the appropriate yield to pay back the debt. So then we fall into a debt trap. And when we do that, they ask for equity, and with equity, we lose sovereignty, and we lose control. I think it is very important that the international community understands what is happening to a number of countries. It's very worrying what is happening in Sri Lanka. All climate vulnerable countries are debt-ridden, and if, for instance, Sri Lanka has another disaster this June, and the way things are going, it is likely, then it would be very, very, very difficult for them to overcome that while they have all this debt. Now, we are spending more than 30% of our budget on adaptation. And this is money that we have to spend on schools, we have to spend on healthcare, we have to spend on housing, but we are putting all this money into adaptation. And on top of adaptation, we have to pay back the debt, and we are spending another 30% of our budget on debt repayment. This is really, really unsustainable. And we are walking with our eyes closed into a disaster.
So what can the world do to ensure that the nations, such as those which are really debt-stricken, are also given new investments and look for preserving their assets, and they are not left to fend for themselves? How can global coalitions or partnership work in this regard? And can these countries also carve out their own direction and look after their interests? What is your experience in the Maldives? And if you can base it on your previous experience, it will be very nice.
For instance, if you take the housing projects, now it's 7,000 homes built at extremely high prices. Usually, it's about 1,900 rupiah for a square feet to build. Usually, it's about 900 rupiah to build a square feet, and it's luxury apartments. These things had cost us 1,900 rupiah a square feet, and therefore it would we have to subsidize the flats, because these are low-cost housing. No one is going to be able to pay anything above 5,000-6,000 rupiah. So the government would have to subsidize the rest of it, and that is the people's money that we collect through other taxes. So this is a very, very sad affair, and I believe that the international community can evaluate, can try to understand what has happened, and be more transparent when you give your money, when you part with your money. What has happened in the Maldives is they came with the money, they came with the people, they came with the material, and they gave us a bill. And this bill is far higher than we can ever pay from that asset. So I believe that we have to restructure these debts. There has to be a haircut. There has to be a new interest rate. There has to be a new grace period. This is not only for Sri Lanka. Guyana needs that. Seychelles needs that. Maldives needs it. Everyone needs it. I think we are in a big problem, and I believe that these things cannot be neglected, and it has to be attended now.
Thank you very much. We move to the next question, and this is for Mr. Hugh Hilton Todd, Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation in Guyana. And here we'll take a little different perspective. We've looked at what the previous panelist has said, and now with the we look from the mitigation perspective as well. As you know, the maritime shipping alone contributes to a large portion of maritime trade, as well as global emissions, as well as local pollutants. And if we are moving towards a global transition towards low clean fuels. And the maritime nations, especially the SIDS, have to change over to cleaner fuels. Does it also lead to greater, burden on them financially, or if there are other kinds of instruments that can be utilized by them to actually make use and accelerate the transition towards greener fuels? So how are these nations helping to shape the global energy landscape and transition to cleaner fuels, and what are the international instruments that can be used?
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be at this dialogue and to represent the beautiful country of Guyana. When it comes to global issues, we need a global approach, and multilateralism is that approach that we use to solve global issues, because no one country or group of countries can handle matters that can affect us all on the planet. In the case of Guyana, we are punching above our weight when it comes to our climate action. We are still a net carbon country. Our standing forests alone is sequestering more than 19.5 gigatons of CO2. Our standing forest also is the size of England. We have introduced a low carbon development strategy back in 2009, which was meant to preserve our standing forests to be able to contribute to the mitigation of fossil fuels and the effects of fossil fuels. And we've expanded that framework to add the blue economy as well as to cater for our emerging oil and gas sector. So we've been doing a lot of work at the national level. We've committed wholeheartedly to the Millennium Development Goals, which was extended to the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. So we've fully committed to that, also with the environmental aspect that is enshrined in that document. When we look at global trade itself, and we know that globalization takes various forms. We've had the globalization in terms of politics, with the democratization of a lot of the world's economies back in the 80s and 90s, in Africa, Latin America, as well as in the East. We've had the globalization of economics, and then you have also cultural globalization. But the focus really here is on the economic form of globalization, which is beyond any country or firm. If you go back to 1990, the global GDP was just about $23 trillion. If you look at 2020, the global GDP, $85 trillion. When you look at the countries that benefited from economic globalization, it's the G20 countries, primarily. One small state is included in that, and that's Luxembourg. And they have a different political and economic history as compared to the other small states who were colonized, who've moved into independence back in the 1940s. So we have been straddled with deficiencies from the time we became independent. The world has moved on, and we have to catch up. We have had to deal with the Bretton Woods financial institutions, whose prescriptions don't really help you. So small states had to be very practical. So when we talk about China lending monies, you go back to 2009, 2010, China lent more money to the world's economies than the World Bank itself. Of course, you're dealing with one country, and they will want to benefit from lending, as the learned politician and former president would have mentioned. It's a self-help basis globally. So when we deal with small scales, who's looking out for our interest? We still can't get special and differential treatment. All right? We still have to deal with the competitiveness in global trade. And we have inherent vulnerabilities that we cannot...
The European Union and the British government give us concessions on fish.
Exactly.
But they charge a 20% duty on our fish.
So you see what's going on. So we're not given any preferred treatment. What is being touted is that you're a nation state, you have sovereignty, and you're equal. We're not equal. We are not equal. We will never be equal. So for us, we have our own challenges that we have to deal with inherently. Then we have to deal with challenges that we did not contribute to. So who is supposed to be treating with that? Not us. You have to ask the countries that are benefiting immensely from global trade, the G20. They're the ones that would need to sit down, and you can break it down to the G7 and G3. They need to have that conversation and really think about the humanitarian side of life, the gentle touch. It's all well with saying that you need to adopt the neoliberal economic model, which most of the world has embraced. But you have to be very pragmatic in how you go about it. For us in Guyana, we are very practical in how we treat with issues affecting us, because at the end of the day, we're policymakers, and our citizens are relying on the representatives to take care of their interests. They don't sit down and say, why is the United Nations not taking care of us? Why is the World Bank not taking care of us? Why is the IMF not taking care of us? They don't care about that. They're looking at the people who they have to vote for. That is our challenge. We are making representations at the level, at the multilateral level, as small states. We've been saying the same thing. If you talk to the Maldives, if you talk to Seychelles, Madagascar, Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Tuvalu, we all are saying the same thing. So why are we not being heard? If you go to the WTO agreement, which is a legal instrument, in the Marrakesh agreement, they mentioned a small blip on environment. But there's nothing there in the WTO trading rules that really addresses the plight of the environment. So global trade is carrying on at its usual rate, while we are facing the brunt of it. So if you were talking about the advancement in technology when it comes to trade, ocean-going vessels and the emissions and so on, we don't build ships. We don't do that. So you need to talk to the industrialized countries who are actually contributing to it. They are making monies. We're not making the money. We are still a net importer of primary products. We're still way behind in terms of our advancement. So the conversation needs to be dealt with at that level, the multilateral level, with those global emitters that should be responsible. And I would dare say who are responsible for the plight of the global environment. So we don't need to look for another planet to live on. This is our planet. And if we don't take care of it, we will all suffer. This is not just a small states issue. This is a global issue. And industrialized countries need to understand that.
If we also talk about infrastructure development and how the SIDS and the other maritime nations are looking at infrastructure development while looking at protecting their fragile economies,
yes,
increasing investment in that sense.
We're talking about resilience and adaptation. For us, it's all about resilience building. As I said earlier this morning, any major disaster can disrupt the entire economy of a small state because we are not diversified. We have a small economic base, a small population. So we have a challenge. We have the Paris Agreement that we are sticking by. The developed countries are not adhering to the formula, even though we know the reality. We know the reality. So the $100 billion pledge that we have not received would go towards adaptation. So for us, we have to take monies from the Treasury. We have to deal with our own sea defense and our own irrigation on our own. We have our own Civil Defense Commission, and I would say that most of the island states, or the SIDS, have their own national policies to mitigate. But we have to do that, because we have to look after our people. But who's looking after the interests of the global citizen? That's the question we have to ask. And we know where the answer should be.
And very quickly, if you just talk about the private sector in this whole globalization and interconnectedness, what will you have to say in very little briefly?
The private sector, there's always a partnership between the private sector and government. Yes? The private sector is concerned with ensuring that their shareholders are happy. They're there to make a profit. Government is not in business to make a profit. There are many private sector individuals who champion climate change and who are doing a lot, but much more needs to be done. If you take the world's billionaires, they can fix this problem overnight. Why are they not doing that? Why are they not doing it? They're making billions upon billions of dollars annually. Monies from the private sector can go towards adaptation and resilience building. Why are they not chipping in? And they're making money from the developing world. That's where they're making their money, from the developing world. So we have to have that conversation. We have a coalition of partners, stakeholders who sit to discuss adaptation and resilience. There's a lot of talk, no action.
Thank you. We'll come back to that a little later. But now we go to Ms. Malshini Senaratne, who is the Assistant Head of Department and Lecturer at the University of Seychelles. Drawing upon your experience, may I just talk about the strategies for sustainable development and ocean-based low-carbon development and resilience strategies as well.
Sure.
And the two main areas that currently are touched upon in a usual sense is one, blue economy, and second, nature-based solutions. But I know you've worked a lot and extensively on blue economy, which drives the overall efforts for addressing climate change by various nations. Can you talk about a little based on your experience and also touch upon the financing options that are available and how these can be replicated by different countries by learning from each other?
Sure, happy to. So my fellow panelists have made excellent contributions towards the whole global problems that SIDS are facing. So I will add to the Seychelles perspective. Essentially, I think I'm one of the smallest islands represented on the panel here today. So we are 1% land, the Seychelles, and 99% ocean. So it makes sense in 2018 that we launched a blue economy model framework and roadmap that basically stressed on sustainable ocean development. Now, this next bit might sound comical because I'm sitting out here in India, but our population is about 98,000 people. That's it. So self-sufficiency for us derives predominantly on global partnerships, regional institutions, the linkages and the collaborations that happen not just with regional SIDS, but also with countries around the world, right? Now, what has been very important to the Seychelles has been the emphasis placed on the issues that are central to our development, things that are perhaps perceived as non-traditional to our global partners. Examples: maritime security, piracy, transnational organized crime, human and drug trafficking. And to a large extent, we push as much as possible our issues on the table, and we have noticed that our global partners do take care and they do take the time and attention to perhaps cater to those needs. Case in point, India, one of our key global partners, very instrumental in our development, and perhaps their help and their extension of offers of aid can be summed up through a string of T's. So you have trade, technology, and you have transportation. So for Seychelles, predominantly, our public transportation has been completely donated by the government of India. So the Tata buses that we have in Seychelles has been essentially a donation from India. Now, we are definitely imperiled as small island nation states. And my colleagues on the panel have made excellent points as to how exactly we are imperiled. But I believe we need to also insert a caution here. The notion that we are extremely helpless and vulnerable has been promoted in a number of sessions, and I would have to agree on this to a large point. But there is a grain of resilience in small island states that cannot be ignored. Islanders, myself, my colleagues in other islands, we're not standing on the beach. We're not wringing our hands helplessly watching the waters rise around us and not taking proactive measures. And to that end, I would like to say that for the Seychelles, we have tried as much as possible to be innovative in our approach to not just debt relief, but also how we frame our development on a global stage. We are reframing and rebranding, and we are talking about large ocean states at this point. And what we are trying to do is perhaps punch above our weight, to take from my fellow panelists there, and we are trying to show that to a large extent we have a voice and we need to be using it a lot louder. So the Seychelles was the first country to launch the Blue Bond in 2015, and following that it was taken up, I believe, by Belize, and 6 other bonds were issued around the world. We were the first to earmark debt for nature swaps, wherein part of the funds that came out of that swap was allocated towards environmental projects in the Seychelles. I myself have been very honored to have received grant funding from these mechanisms in order to run environmental projects in the country. So these are innovative and radical approaches to debt relief, restructuring, but obviously much more needs to be done. And while I hope we stand as a case for best practice, we always look for collaborations with our partners around the world, as well as other SIDS, to know exactly what to do going forward. Last but not least, we have protected 30% of our exclusive economic zone. This is now a marine protected area. This was done in 2020, and this was a target that was met 10 years ahead of its goal. It is now that we are starting to talk about how to allocate those zones, what is absolutely possible in terms of economic activities, where you can have some economic activities and where some zones are completely set aside for protection. We cannot do it alone. I hope the examples I've provided showcases the fact that for the Seychelles, while we are very determined to be sovereign, we are very determined to have also a hand in our destiny. But that ability depends on how well we diversify our economic bases, because to a large extent, we rely on tourism and fisheries. That's it. And in COVID, those 2 pillars simply cratered. To put it simply, tourists and tuna is not going to cut it in the future. So our concerns, while they might seem very small time and small island, are not. They are global concerns. They become your problem when we are not able to deal with it. So there has to be some sort of collective responsibility that takes place. And especially in a COVID era, there needs to be collective responsibility to a large extent. Thank you.
Thank you. And since you've touched upon COVID, may I ask you a follow-up question? How are the SIDS and the other maritime nations positioned to move towards and divert their investments for green, resilient, and inclusive recovery from COVID pandemic?
Let's talk about the COVID pandemic. I keep telling people at the conference that there was no nicer place to ride out a pandemic than a tropical island, but it was tough. We essentially saw our GDP go down to, I believe, minus 13% in 2020. We missed, or we could have done so much better to pivot away from our economic basis of tourism and fisheries. We could have, and we tried to invest into agriculture, mariculture, aquaculture. However, I believe that the low-hanging fruit, that is tourism, was what we immediately went back to, because that is the sector that is the most developed on the island, and therein it was the sector that could possibly help us recover a lot quickly. So in terms of other investment, our blue economy agenda does make space for other sectors that could grow and diversify. We also have blue carbon that is coming up in terms of discussions, because the Seychelles apparently has one of the largest seagrass meadows in the Western Indian Ocean. But to this day, we are still trying to assess and understand the species of seagrass that we have, the extent of carbon stock that the country holds, and how do you translate that to carbon financing, offsetting, and funding mechanisms for the country in the future. It is very early days, but there are opportunities and avenues, I believe, that exist towards that line. Also, perhaps a little bit more of a controversial subject, we also have hydrocarbon that is part of and identified as Seychelles' blue economy. How do you marry the concept of hydrocarbons with the fact that the blue economy is based on sustainable ocean-based development? There is extraction that's happening there. There is exploration that has to happen there as well. So do we remain on the same course, or do we now adjust in a post-COVID world and sort of look at and transition towards more sustainable forms of growth?
Thank you very much. We now go to Mr. Sayeed. He is the Honorable Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs in India, last but not the least. So based on your experience working with in different SIDS and other countries, I would like to ask you a question pertaining to India. And now you've also heard the different panelists. India has a long coastline and it's doing a lot in terms of maritime issues. We have the maritime vision, we have the coastal mission, which looks at sustainable growth. And we also are moving towards a green and sustainable maritime infrastructure, looking at green ports and renewables as the focus, as well as resilience. But having said that, we are also looking at partnerships with different maritime nations, including with SIDS. And there is a lot of good lessons that have been cited where these partnerships have really worked. So I would like to ask you, what is the development model that India has, and what are you doing differently from other models that has worked in this case? If you can touch on.
Thank you. At least first going to Seychelles, where I also served as the India's High Commissioner, and listening to my fellow panelists, I was a personal witness to the developments in Seychelles, especially in the blue economy, and you're pioneers of blue economy because you launched the blue economy department in 2015 and led the way, so to say, and then coming up with this blue bonds and, of course, in terms of, as far as India is concerned, it has extended its support for development projects that support sustainable development, such as safe drinking water, renewable energy. Encouragement is given to innovative technologies and climate-friendly investment. And of course, in the maritime countries, we have also been focusing on carrying out EEZ surveys, hydrographic surveys, anti-piracy operations, because it's very important to control the illegal fishing, because the economy of these nations depend on the fishing, and so on, the coastal radar systems and so on and so forth. This is, of course, as part of the Indian maritime doctrine of Sagar, which is the security and growth for all in the region. Now, I would say that I would take you to the address of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Ugandan Parliament way back in 2018, in which he laid out 10 principles for working with the developmental partners, particularly in Africa and other countries. And one principle was that, and I quote that, he said, our partnership will address the challenge of climate change. We'll work with Africa to ensure just international climate order, to preserve our biodiversity and adopt clean and efficient energy. So that is our commitment for the, as far as the, the climate change is concerned. But you asked about how different is India's model with the other models. Now, we as a nation, our ethos, we believe that we should share our knowledge and resources. Our concept of one world, which takes from the Mahatma Gandhi's concept of one world, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So whatever we have, we should share with others. That has been our tradition. And we had started this almost immediately after our independence. In 1948, India financed loans to Myanmar. In 51, it had provided assistance to Nepal across various developmental sectors like health, disaster relief, and so on and so forth. The basic ethos of our essence of our Indian development partnership is that it is demand-driven, human-centric, and it is a partnership among equals, and it is guided by the developmental priorities of our partners, and there are no conditionalities, as one of the co-panelists mentioned about, as far as some countries are concerned. And then it is basically, it's a transformational in approach. And what we do, there are several instruments which we use. Just to name a few, we have the concessional lines of credit with low rates of interest, long repayment and moratorium, grants in aid. Capacity building is an inherent aspect of our developmental partnership, technical assistance. Here I would also like to specifically mention about the high impact community development projects, which are very useful, which we have found it very useful in, particularly in Seychelles, where I had also been instrumental in implementing some of this, because they go to the grassroots level. These are the projects which are identified by the local communities, and they decide the priority, what it should be. It could be agriculture, irrigation, or small roads, or whatever it is. And of course, India has also been involved in regional connectivity projects, partnering with regional organizations in Africa like ECOWAS, SADC, and others. Now, the inherent difference between India and the other models is that, as I said, India depends, on the develops this partnership model basically as a partner. But some of the models, like for example the OECD DAC model, is basically kind of a aid kind of a model. So there is a donor-recipient relationship. We don't have that. We believe in the idea of equal relations between sovereign partners. So this is an inherent difference, and equal partners irrespective of the size of the country or the population or the economic might. So it is not just doling out some money to nations which require it, but rather a partnership for peace and prosperity. This is what we believe in. And also our model is inherently different from the exploitative debt trap diplomacy, which one of the speakers talked about. We don't kind of offer heavy debt-funded infrastructure, and then the problems which may arise there. Basically, it is a process in which the recipient countries let us know what they need, which areas they need. We don't impose you say if you are strong in IT or biotech or any other thing, we don't say that you take projects in this. It is basically what they want and how they want, with full transparency. This is the essence of our thing.
Thank you very much. And I also wanted to ask about the innovative technologies and investments in research, because a lot of times it's also heard that we have to invest a lot more in the new technologies and resilient technologies while meeting the needs of different maritime nations as well as the SIDS. And how, while we are doing this collaboration and investing in infrastructure development, is there also a mechanism to promote investments in R&D and innovative technology?
Yes, I think because you see, as part of our developmental cooperation partnership, there's a large emphasis also given to the private sector, which could explore opportunities in these areas. And also what we are trying to do is also link institutions of higher learning in India with partner institutions in other countries, so they can engage in research. We have programs with universities across the world. We also had programs in Seychelles as well as in other countries. So this is an inherent element where technology upgradation, capacity building, and sharing of knowledge, and especially in R&D in science and technology, this is something which is part and parcel of the thing, not just only the lines of credits or grants.
Thank you very much. I think it's been really interesting. It says time up, but we started a little
I think the minister wants to say a few more words. And,
yes,
so we'll come back.
I just wanted to close by saying that we now live in a multipolar world.
Yeah.
And if we're living in a multipolar world where there are also other powerful actors beyond the nation state. We have firms or multinational corporations. we have NGOs, we have multilateral institutions. If we're going to achieve global governance, it should not only work when it's in the interest of the industrialized economies. It should also work when it's in the interest of small economies, because small economies are special and we should be differentiated. We are. That's a reality. And if we're going to compete in a global environment, global governance has to also take into consideration our realities. And that is important for us. What we're faced with is that when we have a challenge that is global, that affects us, our voices are not being heard or attended to. And that should stop. There's enough monies in this world. We're not short of financing. There's enough money in this world to fix problems. Why is it not being attended to? Why is it not? Are we second-class world citizens? The last time I checked, we're not. We're human beings. We live on the same planet. And this is our planet, and if we're going to preserve it only for a few, it doesn't make any sense, because it's going to affect us all. If we disturb Mother Nature, it's going to come back to affect all of us. And we have to be cognizant of that fact and treat with it the way it should be treated. The literature that speaks to small states as dependent on foreign aid, foreign investment, migration, and remittance, that is no longer sustainable for us. We have to compete. The world runs on trade and commerce. And for us to do that, we have to be also treated fairly. That's all we're asking for. Equitable treatment. We don't want any special treatment. We just want to ensure that our challenges are being met, and the challenges oftentimes are not of our creation. Full stop.
If I may, on how small islands or someone else would go about on this energy transfer issue. One of the things that we really do want is what countries would have to have is proper legislations that would attract foreign direct investments. I'm talking about power purchasing agreements and feed-in tariff systems, and also an arrangement on how the profits for the investor can be repatriated. Would it be repatriated in foreign currency, or would it, of course, people wouldn't want to carry a whole lot of Maldives rupiah, but they can come here to the Maldives, make money, and take it. I think there is a need for proper legislations. And also there is a reluctance on part of big investors to come because we have a coup every other day. And there is a need to guarantee these contracts against these kind of shocks. So the World Bank, hopefully, must come up and say, look, whatever happens, we will maintain these contracts. I think a lot of people are unable to come because of these difficulties that we also ourselves have. But please, we didn't do this. We did not destroy the planet. We had no part in it. Guyana has more trees than England because they cut everything off to come and capture Guyana. They built ships out of that. And now we have to again rebuild. And she is trying to save the world by seaweed, planting seaweed. While if you go over any of these European countries, you would see it's flat, not a single tree. But these were woodlands. So we must go back to reforesting. We must change farming methods. We must go into vertical farming. And please don't depend on us, our seagrass, for you to survive again. Yes, we do have seagrass. And yes, ocean is a big sink. And it can sink a lot of carbon. But so, you need to plant trees. Thank you.
Thank you. Any last comments from both of you But I think Sameer is asking us to close.
We actually, you can. Last comments are fine. I don't want to take the mic away from you. So if you have last comments, Malshini or...
I'll take the final comment.
Yeah.
1.5 or stay alive. I think that is something that we all need to think about as we close this panel out. The response to seagrass, I would like to address as well. Blue carbon stock and perhaps the ability to finance through blue carbon stock remains a very viable option. We are absolutely for reforestation, but we also have to consider new and futuristic methods of perhaps addressing and using the assets that we've already got. That being said, it remains a collective responsibility. So absolutely, we are not net emitters of carbon. We are absorbing much of the world's carbon, and it remains a collective responsibility in a post-COVID era, how we manage the situation in the future. Thank you.
Mr. Sayeed, any?
I think I echo that, and as we said, we really work together with our partners, especially our philosophy is to work on the basis of equality, what the speakers have said, that our model of cooperation talks about, nations as equal partners. So as you see, then all these successful models which we all have. And I think it is as far as the climate change is concerned, definitely it is a collective responsibility, and it is also the responsibility of those who have actually developed at the expense of other nations. And now I think it is time for nations like India and others to also expect the developed world to kind of share their responsibility with us. So that's the essence of it.
Thank you so much. It is collective responsibility to address collective challenges, and it is also for the like-minded countries to come together to make their voices heard, to embark on green recovery and resilient infrastructure. Having said that, I'm really sorry that we didn't have time for time for questions, but it was an intriguing discussion here, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the...
Thank you, Preeti, and thank you to all.